Genesis chapter 3. This chapter is going to be a major turning point from what we've read so far. But up to this point, just to review, in Genesis chapter 1, we have the creation of everything, right? Man and woman are created in God's image, right? God created everything for us and for Him to dwell with each other. And we were created in God's image to have dominion and stewardship over all the earth for Him, right? We do it with Him and for Him. We were commissioned to be fruitful, multiply, have many children and descendants, right? So we have a job to do, right? Eat fruit, enjoy the world, and just shine forth His image. It's simple mission, right? And in Genesis chapter 2, we get the creation told from the perspective of relationship with God, with one another, and with all the creation, right? We were given a perfect paradise, right? The Garden of Eden, to steward it for God. And we steward it so we can express our love for Him, and we're to guard it from all evil and wickedness. So, how did mankind do? Well, we don't know how long they were actually in the garden doing this before they had their first encounter. So we have a figure that shows up in verse 1 called the serpent, right? Or it's the Nachash in Hebrew. And who or what is this serpent? There are a lot of ideas that are out there, a lot of talk, in Christianity and Judaism. And I think these are ideas that develop as we go throughout the scriptures, as we go throughout history, and God gives us more and more revelation. But for right now, I just want to go strictly with kind of like what the text says, but also in the mindset of the people whom this was given to. Again, Genesis was written to a people, Israel, who around the 1450s to 1400s BC, okay, so that's 3,500 years ago almost, and it was given to them who lived in a particular cultural context, right? They were surrounded by Egypt and Mesopotamia and Babylon and all these different groups of people who had their own beliefs, their own gods and goddesses, and just all this ancient religion. And while most of these religions were false and they were based on false premises, there was some truth to it all, right? Because all of mankind came from a common source. And so there's going to be some truth in the traditions. A lot of times it's distorted, right? And so anyways, but there's a cultural context that Israel grew up in. And maybe there's some understanding that comes from that cultural context that we don't actually get explained in our scriptures. It was just something that they knew. And this is what scholars are trying to go back and figure out as we study the ancient world and as we study the cultural context of the world that our scriptures were written in, right? So the word for this serpent, right, is how it's usually translated, the snake or the serpent. It's the Hebrew word nachash. Now, nachash in the ancient world, it has the meaning in Hebrew kind of like a winged serpent. So potentially we have a dragon here, not actually just a serpent like a snake on the ground, but perhaps a dragon, which in almost every ancient culture of the world, they talk about dragons. They talk about these figures, these flying winged serpents, right? Kind of like a dinosaur that flies. Now, is this what this is? We don't know. We do know that it was a winged serpent. The word Nachash also gives off like an angelic or shining a picture to it, right? So very likely, the same word is similarly used elsewhere in Scripture, and it's referring to what's later called a seraph, which is a particular angelic being that's actually in God's throne room. We'll see this in Isaiah chapter 6 as one that's coming to mind right now specifically, where there's a vision of the throne room of God, and there are these figures called seraphs, which are actually winged serpent angelic beings. They were shining ones. So is it possible that this being in the garden wasn't just a snake, like a snake like we see, but actually it was an angelic figure, a seraph that Adam and Eve would have had, well-known knowledge of, right? It would have been the reason why Eve wasn't scared, to speak with it. And not just Eve, but Adam was actually there in the context as well. is just the serpent, or this Nachash, this, maybe it's a seraph here, was speaking, specifically to Eve in the context, but Adam was there in the background as well. But it could explain why they had no problem speaking to this creature, because this was like an angel, right? This was a creation of God. It was a servant of God, that likely went astray. So this is just a theory to throw out at you. To me, it makes a lot of sense, but just want to throw this out to you. In the ancient Near East, the world that Israel lived in at the time, where they were receiving this Genesis account, there was, and their iconography, their drawings, and the legends of the time, there is this serpentine figure of a winged serpent, that basically is angelic, is very crafty and intelligent and shrewd and wise, and sometimes in a good way and sometimes worshipped, sometimes in a very negative way as a deceiver, right? And in ancient Egypt specifically, which is where we're going to see Israel came out of Egypt, bringing a lot of the Egyptian ideas with them, that God is now having to correct. But in ancient Egypt, there were these snake serpentine figures that they would actually come after the kings as they were going into the afterlife, the pharaohs. And in order to stop these winged creatures, these serpent creatures, they would be cursed to fall down. Like, there were specific incantations for a serpent. You were to fall down and you were to crawl on your belly and get away from me, right? So these were like curses that these pharaohs supposedly would be pronouncing as they were going into the afterlife, and they were about to be deceived from being accepted by the underworld deity or whatever. So obviously that's false, right? But it goes to show that there was some ideas of the serpentine figure that you could stop it by cursing it to fall down and crawl on its belly, which, if you've already read Genesis 3 here, you'll see that the curse, the pronouncement that comes against this figure, this Nachash, is that it's going to be cursed to crawl on its belly and eat dust, right? And it was sent away. So maybe there's something there, right? And it's potentially, if this is a seraph figure, then it could be being paralleled with a snake in this passage, to just drive home its abasement, right? Like, hey, you're being abased, like just like the snakes of the field, right? You were a great angelic being, and now you're cursed to be like a snake in the field. Okay. Again, take it or leave it, but it is interesting that whatever this thing is, Eve had no problem speaking to it. So maybe animals were talking at that time, and it was very normal to Adam and Eve. But it was also described in verse 1 as being very crafty and shrewd, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Not necessarily a bad thing. It can be a very good thing to be crafty and shrewd in a right context, but when you have deceptive motives, then it could be a very bad thing. And it's used in contrast to the nakedness of Adam and Eve, which is talking about their innocence. They're so innocent in their heart and mind, they don't even know that they're naked. It's like little children, my 2-year-old, she can run around the house completely naked and have no shame, no, mental cognition that maybe she should get some clothes on. I know, because I asked her. So I think there was some childlike innocence to Adam and Eve, but yet here's this shrewd and crafty serpent who has some knowledge and some understanding that he's going to use to deceive mankind here. So in the last video, we saw the announcement of this tree of knowledge that Adam and Eve were told to stay away from. They were not to eat of it, for in the day that they would eat of it, they would surely die. So what is this tree of knowledge? Well, we know that the serpent here tempts Adam and Eve or Eve specifically here, to eat from the tree, right? The tree, we know, what we know of it so far is that it is in the middle of paradise. So if it's in the middle of paradise, more than likely it cannot be an evil tree, right? I mean, it could be. God could have put it there to basically be a test for mankind, as when we don't eat from it, we're showing that we're trusting God, and I believe that's true. But I mean, it'd be almost like at our church, if our pastor would set up some, cocaine, on the desk or something in, the lobby area of a church building, and saying, well, I set the cocaine here, I'm setting these drugs here, with the idea that, just don't touch it because it shows that you're really going to honor God in this place. And it's like, yeah, that is true, but that still seems very weird. Why would you do that? And not even just like in the lobby. I mean, we're talking like this tree of knowledge is in the middle of paradise here. So I'm going to suggest that more than likely the tree of knowledge is not an evil tree. And we see throughout the rest of Scripture as we go on, having the knowledge and the understanding of what is good and what is evil, from God in Scripture, it's a very good thing to have that knowledge. But it's good to have that knowledge of good and evil from God. That's where I believe the fall happened here, is God is the one so far in Genesis chapters 1 and chapters 2, good has only been defined to God. God has been the one to define what's good. He said, day one, everything was good, right? And he called it good. And then at the very end of creation, he says it's all was very good. And man, it's not. And then he says it's not good for man to be alone. So God is the ultimate knower of what is good and what is evil. And more than likely, he wanted to give this to mankind as they showed maturity in trusting God, because they're called to steward the creation, right? That's our mission. That's mankind's mission, which I'm going to, suggest has not changed. We've only just been given a little more detail of what that looks like. But it was always mankind's mission to do this. But we're called to trust in God. Let God teach us, his knowledge directly and not go after it for our own gain. But here's mankind who was deceived by the devil, who basically, or not necessarily the devil, but the serpent figure here. We're told they were deceived into thinking that if they ate it, like the only reason God was hiding this knowledge, is so that because he knew that they would become just like him. They would become like God, knowing good and evil, almost in a way that hinted to them, God is hiding this from you. God doesn't want you to be like him because he knows if you eat this, you're going to be just like him. And that made even, Adam and Eve kind of looking at this tree being like, well, it does look very good. It looks like, man, having this knowledge would be really good because, if God's hiding something from us, well, we can't really complete our mission if God isn't taking care of us. And so therefore, and we can see where they went after the tree, that they went after the knowledge of good and evil behind the tree. They went after it themselves instead of trusting in God. So how mankind went about gaining the knowledge of stewarding the cosmos, that was the sin. How they went about it. Not that they had the knowledge of good and evil, but how they went about and received it. They were deceived into seizing this knowledge to, in a sense, become their own gods. They wanted to become God of creation, the head of creation, instead of ruling the creation through relationship with God, which is God's intention, is for us to do it with him, right? Because he knows what's best. He put it all together. He knows what's best. And ultimately, after they eat it, what do we see? The awareness of the fact that they're naked is the sign of their shame, right? Because now they have knowledge in this rebellion that they did here. Now they know through this knowledge we're actually naked. Like being naked isn't a good thing. And so they immediately cover themselves with fig leaves, which obviously God can see when he comes into the garden. Not that he didn't already know, but the fact that they're hiding in shame and the fact that they're clothing themselves shows that they have knowledge that they've done something wrong and that they're naked, right? It's evidence that they've eaten from this tree that God told them not to eat, which God is going to confront them about. But just to talk about a little bit here about how the serpent misportrayed God. The serpent told Eve that she shouldn't think that God really wants to put them to death, right? It's almost like what he's saying here, like, yeah, God did say you're going to die, but God doesn't really want you to be put to death. He only said this to you to keep you from eating the tree and having this wisdom of God and being like him. He just wants to keep it from you, okay? But the truth is, mankind was already created to be in God's image and likeness. They didn't have to eat from the tree to be like God. They were already created to be like God. That was God's ultimate design here. So therefore, God likely told them not to eat the tree so that their obedience would reveal their maturity to be able to handle the knowledge that he already desired to give them in his proper timing, right? There is a proper path to take here. Yet mankind chose to attempt to seize control of the garden on their own. And that is the sin. That's what caused this major downfall. So then what do we see? Well, verse 8 says, "And they heard the sound of Yahweh God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh God among the trees of the garden. And then Yahweh God called to Adam and said to him, 'Where are you?'" So there's some kind of indication here that, God walks in the garden potentially every evening in the cool of the day. He comes to walk in the garden with Adam and Eve, or potentially this was like a unique situation here. As soon as they fell, here's God coming to find them, right? But either way, God is coming into the garden and they're hiding themselves. And God's saying, "Where are you? What's going on?" But then they reveal themselves, and look what happens. Adam actually blames his wife for what happened, right? He doesn't take ownership of what he did. He blames his wife. He says, "Well, it's the woman that you gave me," right? And then Eve tells God it's actually the serpent that deceived me. He's the one that told me, and so I ate it. So neither Adam nor Eve actually take responsibility for their sin. They actually point to another being for that. And so what does God do? Well, God begins to pronounce, in a sense, judgment upon them for this crime. And so what does he say? Well, one, the first consequence of the fall is we already talked about. There was great shame in the knowledge of their nakedness and rebellion. And then regarding Eve, God speaking to Eve, which represents womanhood, he says, "From now on, there's going to be much sorrow and anguish in your childbirth." Because why is that? Well, because there's going to be a desire that's going to be inherently in woman. It's a motherly instinct, right? She wants to produce children. And because of this desire, she's going to have such a strong desire for man, because she needs him in order to fulfill this, right? To fulfill this motherly instinct, she needs man. But ultimately, what's going to happen is man is actually going to subjugate her as a result. Because she needs him, he's actually going to subjugate her and start walking in authority over her, which, we've seen that all throughout history, not been a good thing. And then for Adam, kind of the pronouncement upon Adam is there's going to be sorrow and anguish for him as well in working and tilling the ground. Like before in paradise, everything just grew. It was easy. It was natural. It was nice. But now he says the ground's actually cursed outside the garden. It's not going to produce as easily as it used to be in the garden. So man's going to be working by the sweat of his brow, trying to get the land to produce food, in order to be able to, survive. And also the serpent gets spoken to as well with the familiar curse that we talked about earlier. To basically he's going to be cursed to fall, to be on his face and eat dust, right? But then there's also, what many scholars have suggested is a prophecy of the serpent's final downfall. It's in Genesis 3:15, and it says, "I, God, will put enmity between you, serpent, and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." So almost like there's this constant conflict that's being discussed here between the serpent and the seed that comes from the serpent, the descendants of the serpent, or those that are going to be like the serpent, right? And those that are going to come from Eve, right? Those that are actually going to be more of the godly, perhaps. There's going to be this constant conflict that's going to be happening here. But it also seems to be there's going to be a particular seed, perhaps, that comes from the woman that's actually going to bruise the head of the serpent. And, I'm going to submit that there was a particular seed or descendant that has come who has truly crushed the power of the serpent, and which we'll see as we continue going through Scripture. But not just a single seed, not just a single descendant, but even many descendants. It's her seed, which could be plural as well, the term seed here. So under those who are truly walking in righteousness, those that are truly submitted to God, they too will crush the lies of the serpent under their feet. and they will walk in true unity and oneness with God, fulfilling his commission, and they're also going to do that in true love for one another. So just a prophecy that was included here in Genesis chapter 3. So what's the final things that happen here? Well, we have this exile from the garden. God is going to send them out from the garden. But what I'm going to submit to you is that it actually was an act of mercy to exile them from the garden. Because if they would have continued eating from the tree of life, they would have been eating from the tree of life, and they would have lived forever in this sinful place of now they have this wisdom, but they really don't know how to use it responsibly because they haven't learned how to trust in God yet. And so they're going to live forever in that prideful place. And just if they do choose to live in a corrupt manner aside from God, they're going to corrupt the creation. They're going to corrupt each other. Families are really going to suffer from that. And I don't think it takes a lot to see that even today in the year 2020, mankind has suffered a lot at the hands of one another by those who have said that they have true wisdom. And in reality, it's not the wisdom of God. And many people have been hurt. There's so much wickedness in the world today. Imagine, someone who's even really wicked living forever and that you couldn't kill them. Like that would be insane. And so in God's loving mercy, he exiles them from the tree of life outside of it. But in addition, God didn't just send them out, right? Even though they were unrepentant, right? Neither at any point did they say that they were sorry. Did they express a true remorse? Any of that. What does God do, though? He's not going to send them out just wearing their fig leaves, right? Which is probably not a very good covering. He actually makes clothes for them. And in the ancient world, making clothes, God giving clothes, or even someone like an elder or father giving clothes to someone, it actually is a symbol of adoption. It was a symbol of favor and protection. It was a symbol of basically of a promotion, promoting them to a new position. So it's almost as if God is saying here, I'm giving you true protection for the new environment you're going into. I'm going to give you proper clothes to wear out there. But also, I'm readopting you as my children. You're not lost. I love you. I'll be with you if you want me to be here. And I'm also continuing to give you the commission. You're still to be fruitful and multiply. You're still to walk in my image. And you're still to take care of the creation, right? Subdue it. Have dominion. So the commission of God seemingly has not been revoked. God still wants us to do this. He just wants us to do it without access to the tree of life now. And now we have the option. Are we going to do this or not? In addition, verse 21, Adam calls his wife Eve, right? The mother of all living. Okay, he understood God's mercy. He calls her the mother of all living. Even though they don't have access to the tree of life, God didn't kill them on that day. They should have died on that day, and mankind should have been wiped out completely with no hope, right? We would have been gone. There would never have been this conversation that we're having right now. But God had mercy, and he allowed them to live on, just not forever, right? And so he calls his wife the mother of all living because he understands that God had great mercy on them for this transgression that they did. So now man is going to have to rule. He has to learn to rule outside of paradise. And he's going to learn the consequences of reigning without God's wisdom and guiding hand, unless they want him, right? So they're still going to have like this priestly, kingly role. They're still going to have the priestly role in the sense that they're going to be introducing God to all of creation. They should be introducing him to their descendants, to their children, raising them up in the ways of God. They're still to have dominion or basically be kings over the creation, but it's modified now. It's not going to come as easily as it did before. And access to God's presence has now become more restricted because the garden is his throne, right? It's his resting place. He'll still come and speak to them because God's not, he's not, stuck in one little place. He's the creator of all the creation, right? He can't be confined solely to the garden. But now he'll still be able to come and talk with them, but the access is not going to be as open as it used to be. And so just as a little final disclaimer, some of the results of this as well. The blessing of food, right, in many descendants continues. It remains for mankind. And yet, due to the vulnerability to death now without access to the tree of life, an urgency has been created to allow the human race to survive. So survival from day to day, right? They're going to have to learn to survive day to day, and that's going to require procuring food for the family. And survival for the human race is going to come through having children. The blessing itself has not been lost, nor has the commission, but a dependency has been created. For man, he's going to be dependent on the ground to produce food. And for the woman, she's going to be dependent on man to reproduce. When they were dependent on God, the blessing came easy. But on our own, it's going to prove quite challenging. So this is sadly where mankind has ended up. What are they going to do now that they're outside the garden? What is God going to do to continue, basically bring the human race back to where they were before? How is he going to get them to fulfill the commission and get them to be faithful? Will they walk faithfully now that they're outside the garden? Did they learn, their mistakes? Did they learn from their mistakes? We're going to find out when we get to Genesis chapter 4. So be blessed and enjoy your reading.